webinar on preparing for tobacco TPMPs hosted by EAS Consulting Group and presented by EAS President and COO Dean Sirota and Senior Director for Dietary Supplement and Tobacco Services, Dr. Tara Lynn Couch. This webinar is presented in cooperation with the Tobacco Merchants Association. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with the prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign tobacco, food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, medical device, and cosmetics firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA and compliance officials and industry executives and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's presenters are Dean Sirota and Tara Lynn Couch. Dean Sirota is President and COO of EAS Consulting Group. He is a highly accomplished executive with 29 years of executive management experience and responsibility for regulatory affairs, compliance, quality assurance, quality control, operations, manufacturing, laboratory, and financial and corporate management. Mr. Sirota works with tobacco, pharmaceutical, and dietary supplement companies to ensure compliance with all applicable FDA laws and regulations. Dr. Tara Lynn Couch is a PhD or analytical and organic chemist with over laboratory and regulatory experience in academic, field, contract, and manufacturing environments. She is a sought-after expert on issues pertaining to quality control in tobacco, pharmaceutical, and dietary supplement manufacturing facilities, including the establishment of specifications and the development of well-organized, sophisticated laboratories. As Senior Director for EAS Consulting Group, Dr. Couch has assisted numerous companies with the development, improvement, implementation of strong quality systems that are scientifically sound, efficient, practical, and compliant with all FDA regulations. She also performs mock FDA inspections, gap analyses, and contractor facility audits. In addition, Dr. Couch provides GMP and laboratory training via seminar, webinar, and on-site presentations. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the chat box, or into the questions box, excuse me. With that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Dean Sirota and Dr. Couch.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Tara and I have put together a presentation to give you an update on tobacco regulations and authority and inspections, talk a little bit about what we've seen happening regarding FDA inspections in the last few years, and then Tara is going to take over and dive a little deeper into what we think some of the things are that you should consider in preparing for upcoming tobacco GMPs. What really prompted us to want to have this webinar is I attended the TMA annual meeting back in April of this year and was on a panel with Mitch Zeller. And one of the slides that he presented was on his priorities that he called foundational rules and guidances. And it was a list of the priorities that the FDA was focused on currently, and this included issuing of tobacco product manufacturing practice rules, which is outlined in 906E of the Act, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So the Family Smoking Prevention Control Act, which was passed in 2019, gave the FDA a lot of authority over tobacco, including authorizing them to promulgate TPMP regulations on the manufacturing, packaging, holding, and distribution of tobacco products. The original act included traditional tobacco products which were made or derived from tobacco and for human consumption, including components, parts, and accessories. And then in 2016, the FDA expanded their authority through the deeming rule to bring such products as e-cigarettes, cigars, pipes, hookah, nicotine gels, and dissolvable products under the Tobacco Act and under their authority for all the requirements of the Act. Just a few sections I want to highlight before we move forward. Section 902 talks about adulterated tobacco products. And it's interesting that in this section, a tobacco product shall be deemed to be adulterated if the methods or the facilities or controls used for its manufacturing, packaging, or storage are not in conformance with the applicable requirements under 906E, which talks about GMPs. So right in the Act, it's made clear that the Congress wanted FDA to issue GMPs or TPMPs to give the industry some guidance on how to manufacture a product. It goes further on to say that a tobacco product shall be adulterated, and it not only just talks about what we're all used to thinking about is something is filthy or putrid in the product, it's been held or packed in an insanitary condition, or it somehow has contained some sort of poisonous or harmful substance. But in subpart 4, it also says if the methods, facilities, or controls used for its manufacture do not conform to good manufacturing practices. So we must keep in mind that even if we make a very good product according to specifications and it doesn't contain a harmful ingredient, that if we do that outside of good manufacturing practices, once they're issued and become effective, your product under the Act is adulterated. Therefore, let's say you made a product and you did it without any SOPs and without any quality control. It doesn't matter that the product is acceptable and meets your specifications. It would be considered adulterated. The Act further defines this in 906E, where it specifically talks about the good manufacturing practices and that the performance of tobacco product, the packaging, the storage, the manufacturing, and the design all must be in conformance with CGMPs, and that these regulations may also provide for the testing of raw tobacco for pesticides and chemical residue, regardless of whether the tolerances for these residues have been established. So the Act was written in a way to give the FDA quite a bit of leeway in how they issue GMPs and what they can require from these regulations. There was a lot of questions in 2016 about, well, will all this apply to the deemed products? And the FDA answered those questions in the Small Entity Compliance Guide, in which somebody did specifically ask, will the newly deemed products be subject to GMPs? The FDA reminded everybody that they must first promulgate GMPs through the rulemaking process, but that once these requirements are in effect, they will certainly apply to the newly deemed tobacco products. And they reminded everybody, though, that even before we have GMPs, manufacturers must still comply with the Act and make sure that their products are not adulterated nor misbranded under the Act as it's written now. Section F, the Section 905 of the Act is also important to note because of the annual registration, which is where we start getting into giving the FDA authority to come in and inspect everybody. Basically, 905 requires that everybody who owns and operates an establishment, a tobacco establishment, must register, and then it gives the FDA responsibility to inspect those facilities by one or more officers at least once in a 2-year period, beginning with the date of the registration, and at least once every 2 years thereafter. So for those of you who have had a registered facility, you are probably going on your third, if you haven't already had your third inspection. Many of the deemed companies are probably close to looking at their second inspection. And so we know the FDA is active in trying to meet this requirement. And under that, they are allowed to inspect at all reasonable times within the reasonable limits of the Act, all of your facilities, whether it be the factory, the warehouse, your vehicles, storage units on your property. They can look at the applicable equipment and how you hold and store the product in your warehouses. And they are allowed to look at your raw materials, your intermediates, your finished products, and take samples. And when they do this, they will show up in your facility with a notice of inspection, which we all know as a Form 482. So ORA has been doing, as I mentioned, inspections for a number of years now. They have created what we're calling a cadre of field investigators to perform a majority of the tobacco inspections. And what's important to note, just a few things, is that the FDA, for the most part, doesn't really recognize certification, other certifications. And what I mean by that, not that these certifications aren't important and do not, and they certainly add value, but it will not change the way the FDA does an inspection of your facility. So for example, if you say, well, I'm already ISO certified, we've been inspected by ISO, it is not going to change the way the FDA performs its inspection or the frequency for which they inspect your facility. For the most part, they have been unannounced. They've lasted anywhere from 2 days to a week. In these inspections, even though they don't have GMPs, they have been looking at basic GMP requirements and quality system elements. We know they've been taking a lot of notes. In the most recent GMP inspections, it seems they were following some sort of outline. I know a number of our clients asked if they could see what they were working off of, and they were politely told no. But so we do think that there is a significant draft in place that they are using, because many of the inspections that have occurred here in the last year have been very similar from company to company. They do look at your formulations, what you've submitted in SEs or other applications. They try to make these inspections broad, so they cover a great deal of subjects, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But they also tend to get a little detailed and dig into the weeds a little bit on a number of the issues that we'll talk about today. One of the things that we recommend when you're dealing with an FDA inspection, especially for those companies who may not have been inspected yet, is that this is a very serious interaction. It can have a significant impact on your business. And like any other aspect of your business, you do want to be prepared. You want to know how to manage one of these inspections. And so you want to have an inspection plan. You want to know what everybody's responsibility is. You should write an SOP that defines how your company is going to receive the FDA, who's going to be called, who's going to manage it, and how you're going to handle every aspect of the inspection. You should assign one of your senior managers or quality unit personnel to be the FDA inspection manager, so that you have one point person who's basically responsible for keeping everybody on task and focused on managing an effective inspection. You want to know what your rights are, what your roles, understand the act, understand what the FDA can and cannot ask for. Simple examples, they cannot ask for pricing information. They cannot ask for personnel records. Obviously, they can ask for training records. So we always recommend that you do not include training records in your personnel records. Keep those separate. It'll be easier during an FDA inspection. You don't want the FDA looking at things like your employees' health care benefits and if they've had some sort of personnel issues. And it's important that everybody in your facility be trained and understand what their potential role is, because the FDA will interact with a number of different people and departments within your company, not just quality. They could interact with human resources from a training perspective. Certainly your shipping and receiving folks for the product going out the door. Maybe your facilities and engineering folks when they want to talk about how you're managing your sanitation practices. Certainly laboratories on the testing of your product. So this is not something that you just want 2 or 3 people trained on and ready to prepare. You really want a wide variety of staff ready to support this. Some of the things you want to consider in preparing for inspection: make sure you have a nice conference room or an adequate area where you can bring the FDA out away from your operations if you can, away from the heavy traffic flow of employees, so that you can have a quiet place to work with them. It'll decrease disruptions and allow the staff to focus on just hosting the FDA and providing them with what they need. Some of the very common documents that they ask for, we recommend you have ready to go. Organizational charts, facility overview, floor plans, which could include material and people flow diagrams, a list of all the products that you manufacture at the site, process flow diagrams, lists of equipment if that is significant, definitely an SOP index. And one of the things that I want to caution everybody about is an SOP. It's not what you call an SOP. You have to look at it from the FDA perspective. So it may be an SOP, it may be a work instruction, it may be a work guide. I've seen all sorts of names of these different documents. And when you give the FDA an SOP index, you basically want to give them a list of all the documents that you have in place, regardless of what you call them, that pertain to the manufacturing, packaging, holding, and distribution of that product, all your lab methods, so that they can see the full list of things that are in place, and then from that they will choose what they want to look at. And just like anything else that you want to be good at, we highly recommend that you perform mock inspections. We're asked all the time to come in and do that for clients. We will actually show up with 482s and affidavits and sample forms and basically go through the process as if we were FDA inspectors, to give the site a chance to interact, retrieve documents, answer questions. And it's not really focused on the compliance piece or how your GMPs, it's really focused on how well did you handle the process. And I think that's very important for every company to be comfortable with doing. You want to have a real well-organized opening meeting, introduce everybody. The most responsible person will be issued the 482. I'm sorry, the 482 from the FDA, giving them the right to inspect. You want to have your FDA inspection manager there. You want to have any key people that you feel that should be introduced and that may interact with the FDA in the meeting. So certainly some of your department heads, your head of manufacturing, your head of QA and QC. It's good to have those kinds of folks in the meeting. And then we also recommend that you have a pre-prepared presentation, no longer than 15, 20 minutes, about your company, what you do, how big your company is, what shifts, how many people you have, what kind of products you make, what kind of equipment. You can show the org charts and the layouts. The FDA normally likes having this type of upfront information. It helps them kind of get a feel for what they're about to inspect. They will ask you for a copy of it. And it's good that if you have that already prepared, have somebody well practiced in presenting it. And again, keep it very brief but informative. They do not want to see a 30 or 45-minute presentation. One of the most important aspects of managing one of these inspections, and I've been both in the room with the FDA and I've also been in what we call the war room, is a room for all the people that are going to support what's going on in the actual inspection. So they will handle all the document control and retrieval. This is probably the most critical aspect of managing an inspection. You want to make sure that you understand what the FDA is asking for when it comes to documents, and that you can effectively and in a time-efficient manner get them those documents. And in that process, retrieve them, review them, be sure that's what the FDA asked for, and get it into the room in a timely fashion. You cannot do that with the people that are in the room interacting with the FDA. So there is this entire process that must be managed, which we call the war room, behind the scenes. You will receive all the FDA requests. You will make sure that somebody retrieves the documents. Somebody will go through it, make sure there are no sticky notes. Tara and I have done hundreds of inspections in our careers, and I can't tell you how many times we've been brought documents, especially out of the laboratories, where there'll be sticky notes with numbers on them or little notes to themselves. You don't want any of that in there. You want to, again, verify that what the FDA asked for is what you're providing them, no more, no less. This group of people in the war room will make copies of everything. They will keep lists of everything that was provided. They will take notes as appropriate on how the inspection went, if there were issues with what was requested and what was provided, if mistakes were made. You want to keep all those notes so that after the inspection you can get back together, look or review what went well, what didn't go so well, and so that you can make adjustments for any future inspections. What we've listed here are some commonly requested documents that the FDA has been asking for in these inspections. Again, your facility registration, they've been asking to see that. Product lists, the facility layout, again, your SOP index. Specifically, some of the SOPs they've been commonly asking for are your quality unit roles and responsibility. So basically a document, whether it's an SOP or a policy, that describes what your quality unit is responsible for in your organization. Many small companies to this day still don't have a quality unit or quality personnel. Senior manager, I've seen companies where senior management, marketing, manufacturing are still making quality decisions. Under GMPs, the FDA is going to want to really see where your quality unit is and what their roles are. They certainly have been very, very interested in sanitation practices and cleaning procedures, pest control, and how you monitor any water that you may use in the process. So those are just some common SOPs they've been asking for. If you have a quality policy or a quality manual, they always ask for that and want to review that. Also, organizational charts. They want to see how the quality unit lies within the organization, who it reports up to, where the decision authority lies, and basically wanting to see if there's any perceived conflict of interest, and does the quality unit truly have not only the responsibility but the authority to do their job. The FDA also wants to know, do we have the right people and are they trained? So they will ask for job descriptions, resumes, experience. So you want to make sure you have that kind of information, especially for your key folks. The next two slides are really just a list of things that we've accumulated over the last few years and what the FDA has looked at. And you'll have access to all these slides. So I'm not going to go through these all in detail, but again, they've been focusing on general GMP concepts, the sanitation, water monitoring, document control, and record keeping. How are you maintaining your procedures? How are you maintaining your manufacturing records? Are they done in a controlled state? Something very important. How are you handling your SOPs and your updates and your revisions? Product formulas and design history files and manufacturing records. As we all know, there is very little opportunity for us to make any changes to any of these products under the Act. So they really will look at, what kinds of things have you changed, if anything, how you controlled that, how you justified that, because they want to ensure that the products are the same products that are on the market as of the effective dates. They'll also look at how you handle your equipment, how you clean it, how you maintain it. There have been a number of questions, especially for companies who are very computer savvy and have implemented computer systems and electronic records and electronic signatures. The Act, in my opinion, does imply that you have to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, which is the electronic records and signatures regulation. And so if you are thinking about or already have very highly sophisticated computer systems where you're using electronic signatures or badge swipes and things like that, you do want to look at Part 11 to make sure those systems are compliant. And then, of course, they're going to get into the laboratories and your testing and your specifications for your raw materials and finished products. They will look pretty deeply into your quality unit or your quality personnel. They like to they've looked at supplier qualifications and how you're testing ingredients and components as they come into your facility. This has been an area where, as a consulting firm, we've noticed a lot of companies struggle. They'll accept things on C of A's. They haven't really qualified their suppliers. It's a lot of times it's been, we've been working with them forever. So they'll look at that. Stability testing, NCPs, CAPAs, complaints. Tara's going to talk a little bit more about those. Again, change control, labeling control. And then also they've been, obviously, because of the act, looking at any branding and marketing and how you're advertising your product at events and sampling and websites and things like that. So with that kind of overview in place, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Couch, and she's going to give you a little bit more insight into what we think you should be considering and looking at when you're looking at your systems and facilities and preparing for GMPs.
All right, thank you, Dean. So now we're going to focus on what GMPs are really about. So GMPs, or good manufacturing practices, are the regulations that are issued by the FDA to control and supervise companies that are involved in the manufacturing, packaging, holding, and distribution operations for food, drugs, and cosmetics underneath the FDA. They are a system of procedures and documentation for the proper design, monitoring, and control of all of those processes to ensure that the product has the quality that it proposes to have. Now, there have been a number of GMP regulations that are currently available, and those are dictated in the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFRs. So you can see some of them that are available here, and of course the tobacco regulations are coming soon. So the CFR, there's an example CFR here in the corner, so you know what that book looks like. That happens to be 21 CFR 111, which is the dietary supplement GMPs. So the little C that we talk about in CGMPs means current. So that's very important to make sure that you're always using modern technologies, up-to-date systems, and innovative approaches. What was current 10 years ago is certainly not current now. Think about a cell phone that you had 10 years ago, or even 15 years ago, they didn't even exist. So making sure that you have current systems is very important. The way that you adhere to these CGMPs requires a quality system approach. This ensures that you minimize instances of contamination, mix-ups, and errors, and you consistently manufacture the product, which in turn protects the consumer from purchasing a product that is not effective or even dangerous from a quality perspective. So a quality management system, often referred to as a QMS, is a formal system of your documents, your processes, your procedures, and the responsibilities for achieving all those quality policies and objectives that the company may have. It helps coordinate and direct the activities to make sure that those customer requirements are met and those quality requirements are met. It also does this on a continuous basis if it's a well-designed QMS system. So it does set the company policy, it defines and improves these processes. Good procedures will facilitate training. It also reduces waste, lowered costs, and engages personnel. So the FDA's perspective is that a robust quality system addresses their goal of protecting public health to ensure that the manufacturers provide consistent, high-quality products to consumers and reduces those or eliminates those events of recalls, returns, or necessary reworks and defective products getting out on the marketplace. So it's very critical that management is supportive of the quality unit and the quality management system. This system has to be has to be a commitment for all levels of the organization, and quality has to be given the authority to make decisions about the disposition of a raw material or a product. Sometimes these decisions are uncomfortable and they actually supersede a business need, but once it's determined that you have a defective product or there's an issue with a particular product and it necessitates a market withdrawal or recall, this is something that simply has to be done and would be dictated in your QMS system. So typically, these are the parts that you will see in a CGMP system that's dictated in a CFR. So we're going to kind of go through some of these over the course of the next several slides. So actually, starting last, we see records and record keeping. And that really is what governs the the whole process of GMPs. So GMPs, of course, as we just learned, are good manufacturing practices, but we jokingly say in the industry that that really means get more paper or get more people. My particular favorite is giant mountains of paper because I'm a mountain girl. So we have to keep records for a designated period of time. We don't know exactly what that time frame will be because we haven't yet seen the TPMPs, but once those are dictated, we will have to keep that for that particular amount of time, and those have to be kept as original records. And as Dean was just talking about earlier, if those happen to be electronic records, they'll also have to be kept in that same original format and kept for the particular period of time as dictated in 21 CFR 11. So what that basically does is anything that you would do in a manual way will also be accomplished in an electronic way. Then we have to allow the FDA access to all of those records, with some exceptions about financial information and personnel information not relating to training. We have to provide those and give copies to the FDA as they request those, and we have to do that within that allotted period of time. It's also important that all records be generating using good documentation practices, or what we often refer to as GDPs. So in the GMPs of various different entities, it talks about always documenting an activity at the time of performance. So we don't predate, we don't post-date, so you have to document something as you're doing it. And that documentation has to be permanent, and it has to be legible so that we can go back to that some period of time later through the course of an investigation, during an inspection, or for any other purpose, so that we can understand what actually happened. And then we have to have to know who did it and when they did it. So if we're doing this manually, this typically means that we're putting our initials and date at the bottom of every document that we sign. So if we're doing this electronically, we would have to have audit trails to demonstrate who performed that action and when they did that. So if we are doing it manually, you have an example of good documentation practices and not so good documentation practices. So all numerical entries have to include units such as kilograms, and those have to be recorded exactly as they're seen on the equipment. The FDA recently put out a guidance document on data integrity in 2016, and it refers to these types of numerical entries as metadata. So that has to support the number. If I just say 119.37, you have no frame of reference for what that means. So you have to actually have the unit. When I say 119.37 grams, that's much more informative and tells me that I'm obviously talking about a weight of something. If I make a mistake when I'm documenting something, which we all do, we are all people, we will have to make an appropriate correction, but not obliterate the previous entry. So we don't write over, we don't cross out, we just do a single line through and then put the correct entry and then indicate why we made that change. So this is what you would do manually, and in your electronic systems, they'll have to accomplish the same strategy in that system. So personnel are the most important resource that you have. So make sure you hire good people and then develop them by providing them with the appropriate training. So in my experience, personnel are not typically trying to not follow a procedure or trying to do something on purpose. They're trying to do the right thing, and you're just not providing them with the means with which to do that if there's an issue. So that's very important. So in the regulations, it frequently talks about having qualified employees, and this applies to the food regulations, the dietary supplement regulations, the pharmaceutical, and the medical devices. This is certainly something we expect to see in the TPMPs. So each person engaged in any sort of GMP operation has to have a combination of education, training, and experience to perform their assigned job function. So they therefore must have an assigned job function, and we have to know what those requirements are for that particular job function. There also has to be supervisors that have the same combination of experience in order to supervise. You can't just walk in one day and then assign a person and say, okay, Tara, no, today you're in charge of engineering. So that wouldn't make sense because I don't have the engineering background. I'm a chemist. So you need to make sure that the people that are being put in charge of supervisory positions also have the combination of experience. And then a group of those people have to be assigned to quality operations and quality responsibilities. So Dean had mentioned that is one of the documents that the FDA is frequently asked to see. This is not uncommon in all of the industries. They ask to see a quality unit, which is collectively your quality assurance, quality control group. They ask to see the responsibilities that they have in the company. So their responsibilities are to create, monitor, and implement that quality system, or the quality system that we're discussing now. So they also assess the suitability of all incoming components, containers, closures, labels, in-process materials, and finished products. They evaluate the performance of the manufacturing operations themselves. That it also includes equipment, monitoring all those activities, making sure that you're meeting specifications and following controls that are dictated. Determining the acceptability of each batch for release. So quality is the one that makes the disposition decision of whether to release a particular product to the public. We also review and approve all procedures related to the GMP, so that whole SOP index, whether it be just strictly SOPs or written procedures or protocols or forms, whatever those things are, those all have to be reviewed and approved by the quality unit. And the quality unit is also responsible for investigating any issues that occur. So if we have any non-conforming products, if we have any corrective and preventative actions that have to be taken, we have any out of specification situations or OOSs, if there's any deviations, any complaints or returns, and we're going to talk about a little bit about all those in just a moment. The quality unit usually is also responsible for auditing and performing evaluations and trend analyses. And these are very critical to make sure that your quality system is going through a state of continual improvement. And part of this is practicing the mock inspection like we mentioned earlier. So as I said, a job description is something that we would have to say what is the necessary education and training experience for a particular job function, and then you should have people sign off on that so they understand what is my job description and making sure that they know what those experiences are that they need. Again, in a GMP environment, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So this is part of our Get More paper. So there has to be a record of the training that's been done. So this includes the type of training, the date of the training, who was trained, and who was the trainer. And that trainer also has to have the right combination of education, training, and experience to conduct that training. The record should also include previous experience. So this is usually comes in from either a resume or a curriculum vitae, could be a job description, or you could summarize all this in some sort of a bio. So something would be provided to say this is what this person had prior to entering our company, and that's how we know that they have, this is where their education is coming from, and this is where their previous experience is coming from. Once they join your company, you'll have on-the-job training, sometimes called OJT. So this will be all your procedural training, all of the training that's about the written processes, how to use forms. It can also be equipment training, also can be test method, making sure that people can conduct a test method appropriately. So there are different types of training depending on how sophisticated the process may be. It could be a simple read and understand type process, so if you can just read the procedure and follow that very readily, or if there's some sort of proficiency testing that would be necessary, that could be with equipment or with test method training. Sometimes that needs to be done off-site, and so you would attend a course, or sometimes that requires a certification. This is particularly usually applicable when you're talking about your HVAC personnel or your facilities personnel that may need to have certain types of certifications in order to perform their job functions. This training should happen initially, and it should be continual. And this does include GMP training on what good manufacturing practices are all about in making sure we're using GDPs. So the FDA expects that to be something that happens initially and on some sort of on an annual basis in some sort of capacity. So people are usually the dirtiest thing in a facility, so we have to make sure that we practice good personnel hygiene practices. So these are very important to protect against contamination of the materials or products that are used to make the product. All employees have to wash their hands thoroughly using single-use soap and hot water, so it's very important to have access to hot water. Hot water is something that we tend to take for granted here in the United States, but in other countries that are exporting into the U.S., they often don't have access to hot water. So hot water is something that you also need to take into consideration. And then you have to have bathrooms that are suitably clean and provide the necessary cleaning requirements. When you're talking about areas where components, products, and contact surfaces are exposed, you also want to give it consideration to using the appropriate protection for those types of materials. So that may include the use of a lab coat, eye protection, gloves, hairnet, beard covers, or shoe covers, but this all, of course, depends on the nature of what activity is actually taking place. Out in the warehouse, none of that makes a whole lot of sense. But if we're actually working on preparing the e-liquid, certainly many of these things are going to make sense. So you want to make sure that you consider what's happening in the particular location. This also includes removing unsecured jewelry or other types of objects so they wouldn't fall into a material or a product. The physical plant is any part of the building or the facility, and that includes the interior and the exterior of the facility. By the time the FDA's actually announced themselves and entered into the building, they probably at least already driven around the perimeter of your facility or actually walked around the perimeter of your facility to get a first impression of what the grounds actually looks like. And they're paying attention to that the entire time that they're walking up to the facility. So it has to be of appropriate structure and design and maintained in a clean and sanitary manner to prevent contamination of the product. So in this picture here, you see all the weeds that we've got growing there. That certainly is a place for potential pest harborage, so that's not a good situation there. This is actually an FDA investigator evaluating a facility. So equipment must be stored properly. Litter and waste has to be removed in a timely manner, so we don't want to have trash cans that are overflowing. Roads, yards, and parking lots have to be appropriately maintained. You want to have adequate drainage for no standing water. Of course, that will certainly attract insects. And you want to have adequate systems for waste treatment and disposal of the waste. The plant should also be suitable in size, construction, and design to facilitate maintenance, cleaning, and sanitizing. So all areas of the warehouse, including the perimeters, must be kept clean, orderly, and free of debris. So it's very common for an FDA inspector to walk along the perimeter and behind all your racking systems to inspect those areas and see what they look like. So you certainly have to be able to get behind them and look there, so you don't want things pushed up against the walls. When you're looking for blowers, vents, and grids, those should be kept free of grease and any dirt buildup. The plant itself has to be also of appropriate temperature. Now, the appropriate temperature is depending on what might be located in that physical plant. So if we're talking about the warehouse and you need room temperature conditions to store your raw materials and your finished products, you need to assess that you do meet room temperature conditions, and it's not 140 degrees in the back corner of the facility. You also want to make sure that you're removing dirt and washing and mopping and sweeping as appropriate, as we kind of discussed earlier. Sanitation, there may be treatments that are required for certain types of contact surfaces to make sure we reduce levels of potential microorganisms. So this would be particularly important when you're talking about some of the raw materials for tobacco. Also make sure that it's appropriately repaired. So you don't want any holes or cracks in the walls or floors, ceilings, doors, and windows. You want to be inspecting all of those areas to make sure that they're not dirty and they're not potentially causing contamination of your materials and product. So cleaning is more than just floors, so you also want to think about tables, wiping down the tables, making sure your restrooms are clean. An FDA inspector will always walk through the restrooms of your facility, and that isn't because they need to use the restroom, it's because they are inspecting the restroom. And sometimes they will methodically go from one area. If you have a large facility, they'll methodically go from the area closest to the water heater to the places further away from the water heater and make sure that you do in fact still have hot water further away. Clean up your area when you're done with lunch and breaks. And when you're using these mops and brooms and squeegees, don't just leave them on the floor with all the dust and the hair and stuff in them. You need to have these hung up and cleaned as appropriate. You have to have adequate space for the orderly placement of equipment and holding of materials so that you don't have mix-ups. So this means there needs to be separate and defined areas for different types of products. So this would be packaging components like non-tobacco material, tobacco, e-liquids, cartons, labels, all those things need to be distinguished and stored in appropriate areas and have defined spaces for those. We also need to identify all of those per status. So there are requirements in all of the previous CFRs that you have a quarantine area, you have a rejected area, and then other things would be free for use. So you want to make sure you have those designated areas. Oftentimes that's done with stickers and via location. This can be done electronically in some of the CFRs, provided that that system is Part 11 compliant. So what is the best practice is usually a combination of those two things. So we usually want to have some sort of electronic inventory system or ERP type of system, but having a manual system also is a very easy way to make sure that you know what materials belong where and what status they have currently. Pest control is also very important. Pests are any objectable insect or other animals, including birds, rodents, flies, mites, and larvae. I can't tell you how many facilities that I've been in and found issues with these sort of things. One facility I was actually inspecting with a colleague, and there was a fly that was actually flying around my face as I was trying to conduct the inspection. So this is a horrific picture. The person here has actually got their pants taped. Not because they don't want to get them into that dirty floor, but because the mice were biting their feet. So, I mean, it's horrific, some of the things that you find. So you have to take effective measures to exclude pests from the plant and protect against contamination. Keep your doors closed at all times. So unless they're actively in use, use appropriate pest control traps, both inside and outside of the facility. Also lights by your roll-up doors, for example, to make sure any flying things are caught there. So it's best to really hire a professional that know how to do this and then evaluate those through your quality department to make sure that they are, in fact, meeting all the requirements and government regulations for a processing facility that handles something for ingestion and or smoking. So equipment and utensils, as Dean had mentioned, they have to be appropriate design, construction, and workmanship to enable them to be suitable for their intended use, and they have to be able to be adequately cleaned and properly maintained. They should be installed and maintained in that manner. This includes equipment and utensils and adjacent spaces to those. It's ideal to have corrosion-resistant materials, non-toxic materials that are designed to withstand the environment in which they are used. If you're in a freezer unit, you have to make sure that anything that would be in there would be okay at those types of temperatures. And depending on what kind of cleaning compounds you may need, you may be using, if you're using some sort of chlorinated compounds or some sort of acid types of cleaners, you want to make sure that your equipment can stand up to that. Equipment always has to be calibrated to make sure that it has the accuracy and precision necessary to meet the requirements for your in-process specifications. So this needs to happen before you first use it and then at the frequency designated by your manufacturer. So they should also always be identified with some sort of a calibration sticker. Here's just a couple of examples. It, of course, then has to be maintained. Once we've gone through all this process of qualifying the equipment and calibrating it, then you have to appropriately maintain it. If it can't be brought back into calibration, then you'll have to dispose of that or get it repaired. There are also very detailed requirements for master manufacturing records and batch production records in the 21 CFR 111 dietary supplement GMPs. We don't know what the TPMPs are going to have, but certainly you're going to have some sort of record for each product formulation and likely for each batch size, and we can do that sort of creatively to make sure that you're consistently manufacturing the product from batch to batch. And so this is the documentation history of the product. So these are referred to as MMRs. Sometimes people call them master batch records, whatever you call them. The purpose for them is to provide the detailed instruction for every point, step, and stage of the manufacturing and the packaging process to consistently make the product to your quality standards, which are dictated on your specifications. So it will identify each one of those points and establish the controls and procedures that are necessary to meet those requirements. Here's kind of a laundry list of what an MMR content should contain. So again, we'll see exactly what they're going to look like in the TPMPs, but that gives you an idea of the types of things that would need to be available in your MMRs. Most importantly are the written instructions. So this is the step-by-step requirements of what has to be done and what verification requirements are also necessary. Some of these verification requirements will be from production personnel, some of them will be from quality personnel. It is noted that in the dietary supplement and in the pharmaceutical regulations, there are two places where two people have to actually do something together, and that's when there's a weighing operation taking place, weighing a particular component or material, and then when that is being added into the batch. So these are something that we expect that will probably also be in the TPMPs, and we'll see exactly how that may be worded. Then you execute that master manufacturing record just by filling it in. So it's basically a template for the MMR, and then you execute that with a BPR, a batch production record. That is done at the time of performance, which remember is our good documentation practices, and that documents that you actually did all of those instructions and followed all those processes, did all those verification steps, whether it be quality or whether it be production. So that's very important that you execute this. So everything that was in your master manufacturing record will now be in your batch production record and completed. So it'll have the actual batch or lot number that you assign. It'll identify all the equipment that was actually used, the date and the time of maintenance, cleaning, and sanitation of all the equipment that was used or references to those, the unique identifier that you assign to all the things that went into making that product, and the identity of weight or measure of all the components that are used. Yields during different phases of the process would also be incorporated into that, and the results of any tests or examinations that have to be conducted in order to demonstrate that you've met your quality expectations as dictated in your specification. And then all of this, when it's completed, has to be reviewed and approved by your quality unit. So this is an essential part of the checks and balances of a GMP system. So this is where quality has to have one of those responsibilities and roles, as we were talking about previously. So specifications and testing are also critical because that's what defines the quality of your product. So these are things that have already been defined. They will be defined for the raw materials, packaging components, in-process materials that would be built into that master manufacturing record, and for your finished product. And then you'll have to then do various types of testing to demonstrate that those specifications have in fact been met. So in the dietary supplement regulations, it talks about 5 different types of specifications or categories of a specification that you have to have. We'll see if the TPMPs use all 5, but there are 4 of these that are used in pharmaceutical and medical device, so we expect that these will generally be covered. So you want to cover the identity, make sure that the method that you're using will unequivocally identify whatever the material or product is from anything else. Sometimes that requires orthogonal testing, which is more than one type of test. Purity, for chemical purity, the inclusion of foreign matter, or also could be microbiological purity for some types of raw materials. The strength, so this would be the strength of your nicotine or any sort of chemical constituent of a flavor. So this is generally done with chromatographic methods, but there also could be some spectrochemical methods that could be incorporated. The composition, or what the general combination of parts or elements within a material or desired product composition characteristics are. So this could be draw for cigarettes and cigars, could be viscosity and density for the e-liquids. You're also then going to have to look at contaminants. So this is going to be performed on any potential contaminants based on local, state, federal, or international regulatory limits. So these all may be different, but you certainly need to address some of those. So this would be gross physical contaminants, so certainly beetles in tobacco. If there's any metal fragments that could be incorporated anyway, this could be in incoming material or during there's a break of a screen or something like that if you're screening some of your materials. Heavy metals, pesticides, and a lot of these are covered underneath the HPHCs, so the harmful and potentially harmful constituents. So some of them are also covered underneath those. Laboratory operations are also addressed in CFRs to make sure that the laboratory has the appropriate controls over the processes that are involved therein, and they will also have a variety of different test methods. So when you provide that initial list of your SOPs and your SOP index, those are certainly ones that would be dictated in that SOP index. And sometimes these run down a different stream and they're called a different thing, but certainly you would have those. So the lab may do method development, method validation, and stability, and this often can be an external lab. It need not only be an internal lab, so this could be a contract laboratory that you're working with. So in general, a laboratory has to meet 5 general areas of compliance, which are making sure they have those written procedures. Just like the facility for the manufacturer, the laboratory facility has to be appropriate to conduct that testing and examination. Here we're not necessarily talking about controlling the contamination of the product. We're really talking about contamination of the sample to make sure that our results are accurate and precise. Laboratory control processes are reviewed and approved by somebody in quality, and then you're using appropriate scientifically valid test methods or validated test methods depending on how the TPMPs are written, and documentation of all of these things that are undertaken in the laboratory. So when things don't go as planned, which of course always happens, you then needed to conduct a non-conforming product investigation. So that's an NCP. Frequently that's what it's referred to as. So any sort of quality incident is an NCP that could lead to a non-conforming product, has to be investigated. And this is another one of those essential parts of the checks and balances that's done by the quality unit. So in general, there are a variety of things that could potentially lean into a non-conforming product, an out-of-specification situation, deviation from the master manufacturing record, some sort of unanticipated occurrence that may have occurred, instrument calibration problems that could have impacted a batch. There are also requirements to do an investigation for a return product and complaints that come from the consumer. So this is just a little summary of what those NCP sources are. So an out-of-specification is exactly what it is. You have a specification, you're not meeting that specification. A deviation can be planned or unplanned. Either of those need to be investigated to make sure that it doesn't lead to a non-conforming product. Or you can have some sort of a general investigation that sort of is a bucket for every other thing that doesn't fit within there. We do want to pay special attention to product returns. So the FDA has been asked to see returns investigations. So if something is returned, you need to evaluate why it was returned and examine the product and see if there's any quality issues related to that product. If necessary, that could require a change that would be done through a change control system or a corrective and preventative action. Similarly, for all product complaints, the FDA always asks to see complaints, so this is their job is to for the safety of the consumer. So this is certainly something they pay a lot of attention to. So making sure that you have a complaint investigation system, so you have a documented initial evaluation of every complaint that's received and determine if there is some sort of issue with the specification not being met or some sort of health-related issue or injury. Then you would investigate that and all relevant batches or records related to that, and then conduct any appropriate follow-up actions that need to be undertaken as a result of that investigation that's done. And this process has to be overseen and managed by the quality unit, and just like with complaints, if there are changes that are necessary as a result of this investigation, those would have to be done through the change control system or a CAPA system. So keys to success of this whole quality system is a commitment to quality by everyone and especially management. Then we have to have all of our employees being qualified and trained throughout the entire organization, and a quality unit that has the authority and responsibilities assigned to them to meet all of these requirements that are dictated in the CFRs. We have to have detailed written procedures, SOPs, written instructions, etc. And we have to thoroughly document everything that we're doing. So again, this is records. So if it's not documented, it didn't happen in a GMP environment. We have to assign appropriate processes and systems and in-process controls. And we really need to focus on having that traceability from the ingredients of their components all the way through to the finished product and backwards. And that's really what your master manufacturing record and batch production record do. specifications throughout the entire process, and making sure that then we're testing and evaluating in accordance to those specifications to make sure that our materials and products have the quality that they're assigned to have. So Dean and I would be happy to take any questions that you may have at this point.
Thank you, Tara. I know we have covered a lot of information in a short period of time. We've tried to summarize years of experience and interactions with our clients and the FDA to provide you with many things to think about and go back to your facilities and try to assess where you stand and decide where how you want to move forward in preparing for GMPs. We've got about 1 minute. There were a couple of quick questions I'd like to answer. One was a question about the inspection of facilities outside the U.S. Right now, the FDA guidance document specifically only talks about the registration of domestic facilities, which then triggers inspections. So until the FDA deems or requires the registration of international facilities, the routine inspections won't start. But I do know that for applicants that have submitted tobacco marketing authorization applications, there have been some foreign facility inspections in relationship to those applications. But the routine inspections, the every 2 years that we've talked about in this, won't begin until the FDA requires foreign facilities to register. The other question I always get is, has anybody heard when we might expect to see the first draft TPMPs issued by the FDA? I actually sat on a panel earlier this year with Mitch Zeller, and he was asked that question and gave the same answer. He did say they were actively working on TPMPs and that it was a priority, so he confirmed what he said at the TMA meeting, but he would not give any other information about timing. So with that said, we've run out of time. Again, I'd like to thank everybody who took the time to sit in on the webinar. I'd like to thank the TMAs, the TMA who were our partners in this and providing this information to you. And we hope that you found it informative. And obviously, if there's anything that EAS can do to answer any questions or support you as you move through this process, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, everyone.